Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce our friend, Dr. Alan Berger. We're continuing our series of workshops on the theme of emotional sobriety. Dr. Berger will speak to our group on every first Monday of each month during this year. Tonight is the second part of his discussion of how we can apply the 12 essential insights for emotional sobriety to our recovery and growth in our programs. Alan recently celebrated 50 years of sobriety using the 12 steps and over 40 years as a practicing psychotherapist specializing in addiction recovery, with an emphasis on, you guessed it, emotional sobriety. Dr. Berger will bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to us each month in his presentations, again, followed by a Q&A session. As I said a bit ago, Alan will be speaking on insight number 2 from his book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety. That second insight is living life consciously. And now I'm turning it over to Alan, and it's so good to see you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Susie. It's always good to be here with you and this group, and I'm glad you called me one of your friends. I like being your friend. Starts to sound like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to me.
That's okay.
Do you remember Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood?
Of course.
A lot of fun. Yes, today we're going to get into the second insight I talk about in my new book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety. So let me share my screen with you because I do have some slides that I want to go off of. Well, as Susie mentioned, this may not be let's just see where we are. Yes, we're going to talk about living life consciously. Well, this is reportedly what Dr. Carl Jung said to his patient Roland Hazard when he was treating him. Some of you may know the history about this. Roland Hazard was from a very wealthy family in Connecticut. He struggled with his problem with alcohol. And as happens with many wealthy families, they look for the best place to send their child or the family member to treatment. And he was sent over to Europe to treat with Dr. Jung. And after a period of time, Dr. Jung was humble enough to say, I don't think I can help you. Sometimes telling somebody I can't help you can be a good thing. All right, because it turned out that this was a good thing. And this is what he was reportedly had said to Roland Hazard. He goes, here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have what are called vital spiritual experiences. Today, we call them spiritual awakenings. These spiritual awakenings appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Well, let's just stop for a minute and think about that. What is happening to somebody that has a spiritual awakening? Well, I like to think about it as that their whole personality is undergoing a reorganization. You see, we organize ourselves around certain beliefs, around certain ideas. A very famous American psychologist, Dr. Kelly, talked about this. And when I say we organize ourselves around these beliefs, we create a whole way of being in the world that supports these beliefs that we have. So if I believe that things should be a certain way, that's how I look at the world. I look at the world through this lens created by these shoulds, or what I like to call should demands. So now I evaluate every situation based on whether the situation is the way I think it should be, the way I think it's supposed to be. That's a variation on a should. I look at myself in terms of, am I the way I should be? Am I behaving the way I think I should behave? I look at you in terms of, are you being who you should be? Are you behaving the way I think you should be? So my whole personality is organized around this, because I'm trying to be a good person. I try to be what I should be. And I expect you to be what you should be. And I expect life to be a certain way. So let's say these shoulds are based on life should be easy. I should be happy all the time. I shouldn't be disappointed. Things should go my way. Well, can you see what a setup that will be? If I go through life living with that kind of a consciousness, then I am constantly frustrated with what is happening. So life is not going to perform to my expectations. Life is going to be what life is going to be. But if I have all of these shoulds, these expectations on what's supposed to happen, I'm going to be constantly struggling with this frustration that things aren't the way they should be. I'm going to be stuck in objecting, and eventually that leads to some self-pity. And then for those of us that are alcoholics or also use drugs other than alcohol, that means to getting high and getting loaded and getting drunk. So when these spiritual awakenings happening, our whole personality has to get reorganized. The parts of ourselves, like the should part of us, that has all of these ideas about how things should be, we're going to call that the top dog today. Well, that part has to be put in a different place. It can't be put in charge of our life, because if the should part of you is running your life, you're still going to be, experiencing this tyranny of the shoulds and supposed tos. They're going to govern everything that you're doing and everything that you're experiencing. So when we start to have this spiritual awakening, this reorganization starts to happen. Well, the first phase of that is obviously a deconstruction of the way that we are approaching life. You've heard me say this many times, Herb Kagan, if you're coming to his workshops here, the consciousness that is creating a problem can't solve it. Albert Einstein was noted as saying that about, what's going to happen when we unleash nuclear power into this world. The consciousness that's creating a problem cannot solve it. Well, same is true here. If you're stuck and you're into all of these shoulds, you can't should your way out, so to speak. There's no way that's going to happen. You have to become disillusioned with the way that you're living your life. Now, how can you get to that place where you're disillusioned? In the program, we hear people talk about hitting bottom. That's the disillusionment. How do we get to that place? Well, this is where living life consciously comes in, is we need to allow ourselves to experience what is happening. The problem is when we're into these shoulds, we don't experience what is happening. We experience what should be happening. If I shouldn't be angry, that even though I might be angry, I'm not going to let myself feel angry. If I'm not supposed to assert myself and let you know what's really important to me, because, of course, that would be too bold, then I'm going to keep my mouth shut. You see, the way that we've arranged ourselves is going to mean that certain parts of us are okay and essential to our personality, and other parts of our personality are going to be either relegated to a secondary or a tertiary role. Other parts are going to be outright rejected. Let's say that I've followed this path, what we call the appeal of love, and I will be okay if I find that one person that loves me, and that I can love unconditionally, right? Let's say that's my idea. Well, if that's my approach to life, it means my job is to meet the needs of that person. Any part of me that's needy is going to be rejected. I'm going to be ashamed of those feelings. I'm not going to share those with you. I'll be totally attentive to everything you want, but inattentive, unresponsive to what my needs are. And we do that in many ways. If it's the appeal of mastery that we're following in our life, and we think that that path is going to lead to glory, then all the parts of us that are competitive and have to win and all of that are going to be definitely pushed forward. They're going to be essential to our personality. Any part of us that is insecure, doubtful, lacks confidence, what are we going to do with them? You're not going to know about them. I'm going to hide them. I'm not going to let you see those parts of me. So now listen to the rest of what Dr. Jung said. Ideas being these beliefs, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces. You see, our beliefs and attitudes and emotions, or the emotions and attitudes that come from the way that we think things have to be, they became our guiding forces. They influenced, or if you will, determined, and that's going to be an important word today, is being aware of the forces that are determining our life. They determine the direction that our life and our development took. So the ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces for the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side. There's a deconstruction that takes place. We call it a letting go of our old ideas. And a completely new set of conceptions, we'll call those beliefs, ideas, philosophies, and motives begin to dominate or guide them. So we start to let go of what's not working in our life, and we become open to trying on some new ways of being. In a way, you can say that is the essence of humility. A low focus on ourselves, an accurate, not an over or underestimation of our success and worth and accomplishments, and the ability to acknowledge our limitations, our mistakes, our gaps in knowledge, etc. That's what happens as we begin this process of recovery. And as we talked about last month, we talked about the first thing that we become aware of is that we are going through life asleep, dreaming that we're awake. That's what Berger said. We go through life asleep, dreaming that we are awake. When we start to wake up to that, I like what the analogy Herb Kagan uses all the time. He says, Herb Kagan says that we begin to thaw out. And if you think about it this way, our consciousness begins to thaw out. It's a great way, I think, of thinking about it. So this is the process that's taking place for us. I say it this way, the quest for greater awareness of ourselves and our world is a healthy approach to living and allows us to achieve emotional sobriety. But you must understand there are a lot of forces at work within you that want to keep you asleep. There's what we call selective inattention. We don't pay attention to things that are going to make us uncomfortable, that we're going to be anxious about, that are not going to fit with who we think we should be. And we have to be committed and willing to endure discomfort in order for this to take place. Because remember, all the things that we developed, all these attitudes, all these shoulds, they were what we thought we needed to do to be okay. So when you let them go, it's not going to be easy. Even if, though it's a soggy life preserver, it was a life preserver for us. Maybe it just barely kept us afloat, but we were barely kept afloat. So when we let these things go, it will not be easy. And we need to have some compassion and understanding of that as we take this journey. But we also have to understand and develop what we call a meaningful endurance, the ability to endure discomfort in the spirit of growing ourselves into what we can be. This is Dr. Nathaniel Branden, and I love this quote of his, because this helps us get in touch with exactly what's at stake here. If we do not bring an appropriate level of consciousness to our activities, to our life, to our recovery, if we do not live mindfully, the inevitable penalty is a diminished sense of self-efficacy and self-respect. So how is it that our consciousness is related to self-efficacy and self-respect? Well, I think that my next example of this is going to make that pretty clear. When they've done research into, is there any such thing as an alcoholic personality, an addictive personality? You know, we hear people talk about that all the time. You know, we have an addictive personality. Well, the truth of it is when psychologists have researched that question, they have not found that there is one particular kind of person or personality that is more at risk to develop alcoholism than another, or addiction than another. We call addiction an equal opportunity destroyer. Doesn't matter who you are, what kind of a personality you had. If it's a part of your life, it'll destroy it, just like it'll destroy anybody else's. Whether you're wealthy or poor, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you know, regardless of what race you are, doesn't matter. If this gets a hold of you, you are in for a hell of a ride. Now, the one thing that did stand out in this literature, while they did not find an alcoholic personality or an addictive personality, they did find one thing that was true across the board, and that those of us that suffer from addiction do not learn from our experience. So really take that in for a minute. We don't learn from our experience. Well, how is it that we don't learn from our experience? Well, in the program, what do we hear people say all the time? You know, insanity is what? Doing the same thing and expecting. We say different results, but I don't think we expect different results. We expect better results. We do the same thing. We pick up the drink again, or we use some heroin again, or whatever our thing is. And we think that somehow the outcome is going to be better this time. And typically, it's not better. It's what? Worse. This is a progressive illness that we have. We don't learn from that. You know, if you pick up a hammer and you hit your hand and it hurts, you're not going to pick up the hammer and hit your hand again. You're just not going to do that. But with alcoholism and drug addiction, we do it all the time. We are not learning from our experience. Something is interfering with that process. So the mind is conspiring against processing the information that we are getting from our experience and growing ourselves from that information. When you were a child, what happened when you were starting to learn to walk is you'd go ahead and take a couple steps and you'd fall. Now, your falling was very important because your falling provided all kinds of important information to that child's experience about how to walk. I tightened this muscle too much. I didn't relax this muscle enough. I contracted this. I relaxed that. That information is being processed at an unconscious level. The child's not thinking of these things. The brain is just making these adjustments. And every time the child walks and falls, the brain gets more information in terms of that's being processed in all different parts of the brain, but essentially in the motor strip, in the cerebellum, and it's coordinating all of the body's muscles to help us learn how to walk. How many times do you fall when you're walking? Susie, how many times did you fall when you were walking? Did anybody keep track of that?
9,752 times.
I knew somebody must have that record somewhere. It's got to be up in that, it's got to be a large number. And that's okay, because we fall as many times as we need to until we figure it out. Now, thank God we didn't have an expectation. Thank God somebody didn't say to Susie, okay, Susie, you're a year old. You're going to get 50 chances at this. And if you don't figure this out in 50 times, you're not going to walk the rest of your life. You're going to crawl through life. We'd be a population of people crawling around this planet. Nobody would be bipedal. We wouldn't do it. So this is at an automatic level. We're processing information and taking it in. And because it's automatic, there's none of these shoulds that get in our way that tell us we should be doing this a certain way. So when we start to live with a consciousness, we start to pay attention to how we get in our way. We start to become aware of how we limit ourselves in our function. We start to become aware of these rules we have about how we should be. This becomes a very important part in terms of learning how to function better, because our rules are getting in the way. They're typically not helping. They are interfering. They are limiting or disabling our ability to function. They are not facilitating it. And that's the difference. If a rule is a healthy rule, it nourishes you. It helps you become what you can be. If a rule is toxic, it diminishes you. It doesn't enhance you. It doesn't make you a better person. You end up compromising yourself. You end up compromising your integrity. Look, self-esteem can be defined by Dr. Nathaniel Branden, and I love his definition, as the reputation we have with ourselves. Well, if you have these toxic rules, your reputation with yourself isn't very good because you can't take care of yourself. You're totally dependent on certain things happening for you to take care of yourself. You don't have autonomy. Well, you can't have self-respect and self-efficacy without being an autonomous individual. So as we raise our consciousness, we are raising our consciousness to become aware of how we get in our own way. You hear that in the rooms all the time. We had to get out of our way. Well, that's what this means. You have to become aware of these ideas you have about yourself and about life and about problems, et cetera, that are diminishing your ability to cope effectively. If my idea is life should be easy and it's not, I can only conclude that I'm a failure. That's not going to help me cope, walking around and feeling like a loser. If I challenge that idea and I replace it with, instead of life should be easy, that life is going to be difficult. My job is to learn how to deal with it. Then when difficulty happens, what do I say? Of course, this is what's going on. That's what life is about. Now, what do I do with it? What's my best response to it? How do I deal with what's going on? How do I deal with the pain I feel? How do I deal with the disappointment? See, that's the other big thing. We all hate being disappointed, as though life is not supposed to disappoint us. Relationships, we're not supposed to be disappointed in our relationship. After our relationship should be perfect and everything should just go our way. Well, nonsense. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the way that we're raised, how we're domesticated, how we saw our parents functioning in the world. Man, when I look at my folks, they had a lot of shoulds and supposed tos, lots of rules. What we say is the more rules you have, the more undifferentiated you are. The more rules you have, the less faith you have in your ability to cope, because you are trying to set things up in a perfect way so you're going to be happy all the time. Well, this is what Ernie is really selling us when he talks about stage 2 recovery. We lost Ernie a number of years ago to cancer. May he rest in peace. And he says, dealing with the mountain of living is what stage 2 recovery is all about. The mountain of living, the challenges that we are each and every one of us going to face in our life. He says it is about getting on with life by facing, I would say here, by becoming aware of, by becoming conscious of those patterns, habits, and attitudes that control your life. You see what he's saying? Becoming aware of those patterns, habits, and attitudes that control your life, that are the determining forces in your life. Now, until you become conscious of these things, they're going to run your life. Somebody needs to mute themselves. Can you see who that is? Until you become aware of these patterns and habits and attitudes that control your life, they're going to keep running your life. Now, in recovery, and he says, which perhaps for the first time, you're clear-headed enough, sober, or emotionally sound enough to face. You're also committed to facing. You've also become disillusioned with who you were, and you are now starting to let that go so you can become what you can be. I talk about recovery always as the recovery of our lost true self. And that will become more and more clear as we continue on with this living consciously. Susie, do you feel more conscious right now as I talk? Are you much more conscious?
You know I do. Everything you say is what I've gone through. Everything. So I understand.
Good. If there's anything I'm saying that says, what is that? Please jump in, all right? You can dialogue.
You'll see it on my face.
I think so. You are in a small little. So this is Fritz Perls. He's one of the co-founders of Gestalt Therapy, along with his wife, Laura Perls. And Gestalt Therapy was a very different approach to psychotherapy when it was starting to surface in the late 50s and early 60s as a part of the third wave in psychology, which we call the human potential movement. And it was a very different approach. It was based on being in the here and now, not going to the past and looking at what happened in the past. It was focusing on more, what are you doing right now in your life as the point of intervention, as the place where we can make changes. So this is what Fritz said about awareness, because obviously, if this is a here and now approach, it's all based on increasing a person's awareness of what a person is doing to create their existence, to create their problems. And see, this is where living consciously helps us become aware of what we're doing, what we're not doing, so we can discover some new possibilities. So he says it this way: awareness per se, by and of itself, can be curative, because with full awareness, you become aware of this organismic self-regulation. We could think of this as the psychological imperative. What is organismic self-regulation? Let's pause for a minute. I'm going to talk more about it in a second. But organismic self-regulation is that you are wired to move towards what you need and to be able to resolve an unmet need. So if you're hungry, you will consciously start to feel hunger, and you will now start to, first part might be to think about what's in the refrigerator that you can make for lunch. And then you're going to get up and go to the refrigerator and make yourself a sandwich, make yourself a bowl of cereal, whatever you decide to do. And at that minute, now you're taking care of yourself, right? That this need surfaced, it disrupted what we call your homeostasis. And now you take in some food and you're no longer thinking about eating lunch, you're satisfied. We are hardwired to take care of ourselves in that way. We are always going to move towards what we need. And the more effective we are at taking care of that, the more self-efficacy we feel. Now we tie that back into what Dr. Nathaniel Branden said. The better we take care of yourself, the more self-respect you have. The better you take care of yourself, the more self-respect you have, the more self-esteem you're going to have. So when you have this faith in yourself, you can let the organism, you can let this internal wisdom take over without interfering, without interrupting it. You see, when we should on ourselves, we interrupt this organismic self-regulation. We get in the way of it. If I sit here and all of a sudden I need to cry and I say, oh my God, I shouldn't cry, then I've shut myself down and I don't give myself the cry that I need because of the should. So when I become aware that I get in the way that way, I can now, because change is paradoxical, when I become aware of what I'm doing, then a new possibility can exist. That's what we learn in step one. If I become aware of my powerlessness, I can discover another power. If I become aware of how unmanageable my life is, I can start to figure out how to live a better life. I've got to own that before it's possible. How many of us have tried to control alcohol or other drugs or whatever our addiction may be, only to see it get worse and worse and worse? Because you don't change by trying to be something you're not. You don't change by trying to control something that you can't control. If you can't control it, you can't control it. That's why we say common sense is not very common. It's just not. It's not common at all. So we interfere without interfering, without interrupting. We can rely on the wisdom of the organism. See, this is where I think God exists in each of us. Because however we were created, it's brilliant when you step back and look at it. I mean, we're an amazing experiment. I mean, we really are. It says, and then contrast this to the whole pathology of self-manipulation, trying to turn yourself into what you should be, right? Environmental control, meaning trying to manipulate others into being what you think they should be, and so on, that interferes with this very subtle organismic self-control. This is what makes living consciously so important, because awareness, in the way I am talking about it, is our path to growing ourselves in the way that we need to grow, to becoming aware of the things we do that interfere with our growth and our development. Isn't this a great graphic? This is called the cycle of experience. This represents the organismic wisdom that I was just talking about. So we're going to start at that point where we feel this equilibrium. We're not wanting anything. We're okay. We're sitting down, we're enjoying my cup of tea, my English breakfast tea in a Starbucks cup this morning. And all of a sudden, I have a need for contact with another person. So now I become aware, God, I'd really like to talk to Susie. I want to check in with her. I miss her. I haven't talked to her in a while. I'd like to have a connection with her. I have that need to be connected. And I like Susie, so I want to reach out to her and connect with her. So that sensation sometimes occurs outside of my awareness, right? Like right now, and maybe some of you are long into this cycle, right now your bladder is filling with urine. Well, it's always filling with urine, but you don't become aware of it until it reaches a certain point that says, oh, I need to urinate. Well, that happens with a lot of needs. Sometimes these things are bubbling up in us, and then all of a sudden we become aware. Now, when we become aware, if we don't get in the way, if I said, oh, Susie's too busy, she's got so many things doing, she's doing her artwork today, and this is going to get in her way, and she's going to get upset. If I call her, she's going to think I'm bothering her or that I'm dependent on her. I better not call her. So now what happens? I shut down. What did I do with myself? Well, I shut myself off. I'm not taking care of myself. I've just shut myself down. I stopped this cycle of experience from happening. I've interfered with my functioning. If I was aware, hey, I want to call Susie, I mobilize myself. I pick up my phone, I dial her up. Now, hopefully, I don't have to come up with a creative adaptation. I know how to hold the phone, and I don't have to come up with some new novel response to make that whole thing happen, like send her smoke signals or something like that. I get to talk to her on the phone. We talk, we have a chat. I spend whatever time I spend with her. I'm satisfied that I made contact with her. My need was met. Now I'm resolved. I'm ready for what's next. That's how you're wired. That's how we're all wired. So sometimes that need that comes up is a deficit need, like I'm hungry and I want food. Sometimes it's just a desire. I'd like contact. I want to have some fun. I want to laugh. Oh, I got to tell you, I laughed on Saturday night. I laughed big time. So I live now in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And this fellow that was in California owned 4 restaurants out there, decided that he had it with LA. He was going to move to Pennsylvania and he was going to open up a restaurant out here. He started thinking about an Italian seafood, but he thought, well, with COVID still going on, I don't think a lot of people are going to be calling up for to-go orders with Italian seafood. So he decided to open up a Jewish deli, much to my pleasure, right? Much to my pleasure. So it's called the Borscht Deli in Stockton. And once a month, he has what's called the Catskills in Stockton. So in the Catskills, in New York, they used to bring out a lot of Jewish comedians that would perform, like Don Rickles and that whole kind of group. And they would have these wonderful weekends where you could go up, you'd stay at a hotel, you'd go have a dinner party, and then you'd get to listen to a couple different comedians come up. So they had 2 comedians come up this weekend. And I'll tell you, maybe 2 jokes from this weekend, because it was just one. I had such a good laugh. I love laughing. All right, so there's this 92-year-old guy. His wife is 85 years old. She loves going to Vegas to play the slot machines. And so she goes with a bunch of her Jewish friends. They jump on Southwest Airlines, they fly to Vegas, they stay at the, MGM Grand Hotel, and they're on slots all day, and they're, sipping on their wine or their cocktails or their Perriers or whatever, and talking and just having a hoot of a time. Well, and they usually go for 3 or 4 days. And her husband doesn't want to go. He doesn't like Vegas anymore. It's too much of a hassle. So he stays home. Well, this particular weekend, his wife wasn't feeling up to it. It wasn't just as much fun. She decided to come home early. So instead of coming home on Monday, she comes home Sunday. He's not expecting her until Monday. Well, this rascal, this 92-year-old rascal, she comes up to the door, and she hears all this commotion going on in the penthouse. Now, on Wilshire Boulevard in LA, there's these high rises. And I think most of them are occupied by the Jews. And she's up on the 10th floor in this beautiful penthouse overlooking Wilshire Boulevard, UCLA. It's just fantastic. So she comes to the door and she hears all this commotion going on. She's saying to herself, what the heck is going on in my apartment? What is my husband up to? She opens the door, she walks in, and she goes in the bedroom, and here is her 92-year-old husband having this wild, passionate sex with this 30-year-old prostitute. Well, she blows a gasket. What the hell are you doing? Now, remember, I didn't tell you this, for 5 years, he hasn't touched her. 5 years. She goes, what are you doing? She starts yelling at the woman. She grabs her clothes. She runs out of the place. She grabs her 92-year-old husband by his neck, throws him off the 10th floor balcony, and smash. He dies instantly on the sidewalk, 10 floors below. Next day, she's taken to the LA courthouse. She's arrested, obviously, that night. She's brought to the courthouse from jail. And the judge looks at her. So, Mrs. Goldberg, how do you plead? Your Honor, I'm not guilty. He goes, wait a minute, Mrs. Goldberg. What do you mean you're not guilty? You threw your husband off of a 10th floor. 10th floor. What did you think was going to happen to this guy? Well, Your Honor, that's the point of this whole thing. You see, you got to understand how this looked from my side. I've got a 92-year-old husband. He hasn't had sex with me in 5 years. I come home early from Vegas and I walk in and there's my husband fucking like a bunny. Well, I grabbed that sucker and I threw him out the window figuring, well, if he can fuck like a bunny, maybe he can fly like a bird. He couldn't fly like a bird. He couldn't fly like a bird. Smack right on the cement. All right, one other quick joke, and then I'll get back to this. So this guy goes to his rabbi and says, Rabbi, I'm worried about what's going on at home. Rabbi says, okay, well, come on, Sam, tell me what's up. He says, I think, now this may sound paranoid, Rabbi, but I think my wife is trying to poison me. You think your wife's trying to poison you? Yeah, I think that she's trying to poison me. He goes, Rabbi, I've got a big favor to ask of you. Could you talk to my wife and see if you can figure out what's going on? He says, Sam, of course I can talk to your wife. Let's set up a time to meet next week. And before we get together, I'll make sure I give your wife a call and have a chance to talk to her. So Sam comes back and sees his rabbi, Rabbi Silver next week. Comes in and he says, okay, Rabbi, did you get a chance to talk to my wife? He says, I did, Sam. I reached out to your wife yesterday and I got on the phone with her. He says, so what happened? Well, I ended up talking to her for 3 hours, Sam, 3 hours. He goes, my God, Rabbi, that was a long conversation. He says, well, what did you learn? He says, I learned something that I really want you to take to heart, Sam. After talking to your wife for 3 hours, I think you should take the poison. Take the poison. You don't want to live with that woman anymore. It's time to move on, Sam. Time to move on. All right, so back to our talk. Time to move on. Remember, when we have a need or desire emerges in us, it takes us out of balance. To restore our balance, we need to be able to respond to our need. This is what we mean by being able to be responsible. You see, I can't be responsible. I can't respond to my needs if I don't have an awareness of what's going on. If I have no awareness, then I cannot be a responsible individual. I'm unable to respond. Now, this is Dr. Rollo May, and he says one could define mental health from one side is the capacity to be aware of. So once again, we're talking about awareness. And this is where living consciously becomes very important, to be aware of the gap between the stimulus and response. There's always a gap. Sometimes we don't feel it because we react so quickly, but there's always a gap between the stimulus and response. Mrs. Goldberg could have paused before she threw her husband out the window. There was no gap for her. There's always a gap between the stimulus and the response. Mental health is my ability to be aware of that gap. Bill Wilson calls it living in the pause, being aware of that gap, and then being able to use that gap constructively, or go back to the cycle of experience to use my experience to better take care of myself. But if I am impulsive, I am unable. If I'm reactive, I'm unable to get in touch with what this really means for me, and then consulting with the best in myself to deal with it. If something happens that shouldn't happen and I don't live in the gap and start to realize I got a big should here and that's keeping me from dealing with it, then I can just react and object to it. If I live in this space, in this gap that Dr. May is talking about, I can look at it and say, wow, this is quite disappointing to me. Now, how am I going to deal with this disappointment instead of objecting to it? But then he says this, and this is very important, and that's why I made such a big stink out of paying attention to our determinism. He goes that freedom is thus not the opposite of determinism. By the way, emotional sobriety is emotional freedom. He goes, freedom is the individual's capacity to know that he is the determined one, meaning that there's these forces inside of us that are living us. Know that we're the determined one, to pause between the stimulus and response, and thus to throw his weight, however slight it might be, on one side of the one particular response among several possible ones. Ready, aim, fire, instead of ready, fire, aim. Ready, aim, fire. Hit the pause. What does this mean to me? How do I want to respond to this? What do my values tell me in terms of how to best to deal with this? How can I find the best possible response to whatever situation I'm being confronted with? I can give you a quick example, and I've used this one before, but in this context, it may make sense. So this was about, God, it had to be about 5 years ago now, right around Christmas time. I got tickets to see the wonderful play called Wicked. I don't know if you've seen Wicked before, but I've told this story before. Some of you may have heard it. Some of you may not have, but it really illustrates this the situation that May is talking about. Well, I have my little girl was Madeline at that point in time. She was almost 4 years old. And she loved going to the Pasadena Playhouse. And we used to see things like the Beauty and the Beast, in Christmas time, Peter Pan and Christmas. And so they modified all of these great plays to now put in the context of Christmas. And they were a lot of fun. They were audience participation, and we had a gas. And I thought I wanted to take her to the wonderful, beautiful Pantages Theater and see the remarkable sets that they build on that stage. And so, while Wicked was a bit of a reach to take almost a 4-year-old too, I thought that she would just love the whole pomp and circumstances. So I get my tickets from StubHub because they were hard tickets to get the day after Christmas. I think they were like $750 each, and I had 3 tickets, and we had pretty decent seats. And so I go up to the door, and, we were living in Westlake, and we drove into Hollywood and get there about 15 minutes before the show. And I walk up to the usher and hand her my tickets, and she looks over at us, and I think she's going to say, God, your daughter looks so beautiful in her little red velvet Christmas dress. She says, sir, there's a problem. And I go, there's a problem? She goes, yes. She goes, how old is your daughter? I said, well, she's, going to be 4 years old. She goes, that's what the problem is. You see, every troupe that comes into the show sets a minimum age for the audience. And the people that have come in to do Wicked says they don't want any children under the age of 5 in the audience. I go, now first part is to try to negotiate, right? Well, God, where was that on the website? I didn't see it. She goes, it's not in big print. You're going to have to really read to get to it. So it's unfortunate that you weren't aware of that. So now, trying to live a program of recovery, I don't get mad at her for my unawareness, my inability to ready, aim, fire, right? I ready, fired, and now I'm aiming, kind of a deal. And so I'm disappointed, and I just say, well, let me see if I can get my, $2,250 back for these tickets. So I said, so can I take these tickets up to the window and get a refund? She goes, well, that's the second bit of bad news for you. You got these tickets from StubHub, which is a third party, seller of tickets. We do not give refunds to people that have tickets of that nature because they can be, counterfeited. And I go, oh, so I can't get in, and I've got 3 pieces of paper worth $2,250 that I can't use. Bad news. I'm looking at my wife, and she's doing great. She's not jumping on me, and, thank God she wasn't, calling me an idiot. I already felt like one by myself. And so I saw that there was a Starbucks across the street, and I looked at her. I said, well, why don't we go over there and let's just think about what we want to do. Maybe we could do something else now that we're down here in Hollywood. So we go across the street, and I've got these tickets. I thought of trying to sell them, but, you know, scalping tickets in the front with all the security out there, that's not something I was interested in doing. So we go across the street, we get in the line. There's a lot of people in line for Starbucks, but there's these three people standing over on the side. Young man, probably in his early 30s, maybe late 30s, I'd say, with his, what I thought was his wife, and it looked like their daughter. And I said, my God, there's three of them. I got 3 tickets. Let me see if they want these tickets, because they're going to go to waste, and I'd rather somebody use them. I go up to them and I said, look, and I tell them the whole story of what happens. And I go, so I got 3 tickets. The show's going to start in about 10 minutes. You know, please, you know, if you can, please use these. They're good seats. And I don't expect anything from them. They're a gift. Merry Christmas. And I go back in line. And they talk amongst themselves for a minute, and they come back over to me. And he says, do you mind if we share with you what this means to us? I says, of course. He says, I'm going to be going to Texas tomorrow, and I'm going to be going out to sea on one of those oil rigs that's out in the ocean. He says, I'm not going to see my daughter for 6 months. And I asked her what she wanted for Christmas, and she wanted to go see Wicked. But by time that I talked this over with her and tried to get tickets, there weren't any available. They said, well, maybe if you come early and you stand in line, you can get a ticket from somebody's last minute cancellation. Well, nobody canceled today, so we don't have tickets. So we were standing here trying to figure out what we're going to do. And he says, I got to tell you, and he starts crying, you've just made me the happiest man on earth today. And my daughter is filled with gratitude, and she's standing there crying. He says, can we give you a hug? And they did. They hugged us. And then they went off across the street to see Wicked. And I turned to my wife, and my wife turned to me, and we said, you know, that was the best money that we've spent on Christmas this year. Now, that wouldn't have happened if I would have beat myself up, if I would have gotten angry at myself, or I gotten angry at Pantages Theater. I wouldn't have looked for a possibility and what to do with these things. I would have been so wrapped up in self-pity and self-loathing that I wouldn't have seen that there was an opportunity for someone else to find these tickets of value. So that's what Dr. May is talking about. That's what emotional sobriety is that we claim our experience. We don't let our experience claim us. So freedom can never be separated from responsibility. Freedom can never be separated from awareness. Was that, were you saying hi to me, Susie, or you're telling me 5 minutes? You're telling me 5 minutes, I know. God, that's Irving Polster. So meaning can be achieved in 2 ways, and this is how we can use our awareness. And I'll do this, and then I'll stop talking. Horizontally and vertically. So let me talk to you about what we mean by that. So horizontal dimension of meaning is reached through a continuum of awareness. It's by paying attention to what's happening right now and how right now moves to what's next. So now is always in the process of moving to next. Now is not a static thing. Even though we talk about be here now, you can't stay here now. If you're here now, you're aware of how you're moving to what's next. There's always a next. There's not just a now. So that's one way. If we bring our attention and awareness to how things are unfolding now, we can get in touch with whether or not we're paying attention to that organismic wisdom, whether we're following what's important to us and being responsible, responding to what's important to us and taking care of ourselves. Well, sometimes what's happening right now goes to the past. I may be talking about something, and all of a sudden, this situation is reminding me of something in the past. Now, when I let my awareness go to that, I may understand how the past is now imposing itself on my present. Both of these things are important. So horizontal awareness is moving from now to next, and vertical awareness is moving now to then. The then is typically related to something painful that needs to be resolved. So when I go to bring my awareness to this vertical insight, now I start to gain insight. My God, that's why I'm reacting to this. That's what's making me take this personally. Now I see where this rule came from. Now to next makes me see how I'm functioning in the moment. Okay, well, that's a lot. I don't want to say anything more about that. What we will do, I will just mention on the 4D, four dimension publishing. They have started an emotional sobriety study area. It's a great area. There's a lot of resources for $12.99 a month. You get all kinds of my lectures, my audio, my video lectures. You also get Herb Kagan's. And then once a month, we meet with this group for an hour. Herb meets with the group on the hour from 9 to 10 o'clock on the third Thursday, and I meet with the group from 9 to 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on the fourth. It's a great resource if you want to know about it. If you need to get in touch with me, the best way is through my email at abphd@msn.com. Please be patient. I am flooded with a lot of email. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can.